Everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with, I think it might be our last session of the day. You're very good to hold out and hang tight as we work through this. My name is Natalie Gochnour. I lead the Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah, and I've been asked to moderate a panel on the economic impacts of Great Salt Lake. And I've got with me a lot of experts that I don't know, that we just barely met. That's why we were kind of having our little huddle there before. And I even might get some of the pronunciations a little off on the names. Those of you that know me know that my last name's Gochnour, which is Gochnour. You can imagine I get called a lot of different things with Gochnour. You can think about that. Gochnour, I don't know, spellings, all those things. But we do have the Vice President of Natural Resources from Compass Minerals International here, Joe Havasi. Joe, give us a little wave so we know who you are. Come back to you. Thank you for being here, Joe. We have Charles Holmgren, who's the president of Holmgren Farms. Charles, good to see you. We have Gabriel Lozada, who's an associate professor in the Department of Economics here at the U. Thanks for being here, Gabriel. And then we have Thomas Bosteels, Chief Executive Officer of the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative. So nice to have you here, Thomas. So we're going to go off these sort of guiding principles in this dialogue of having a really dignified dialogue. Reasonable people can disagree, and just think through some of the basics of the economic impact of Great Salt Lake. And I will make an observation as a professional economist and someone who works in this field that it's been a long time since anybody's looked at this in any detail. If you go try and look at the economic impact of the lake, you'll see a number quoted, $1.3 billion. It's a 2012 number. By my way of thinking, that's a long time ago. And so instead of being definitive about what the economic impact is, what we're going to do is try and create a greater context to think about it, and we'll kind of see where it goes. And Joe and Thomas, I want to start with you by just getting a better understanding of the businesses, the industries that operate, from the lake, adjacent to the lake. And Joe, let's start with you and just learn a little bit about Compass Minerals. Tell us about your operations in the Great Salt Lake. Introduce the company to us.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. And as you might imagine, in the Great Salt Lake, there's salt. So salt in economic quantity. So salt, you may not be familiar with the term, but sulfate of potash. Potash is potassium, essentially. Magnesium chloride, magnesium metal, and titanium sponge are naturally occurring in the Great Salt Lake and are produced for production. Magnesium and potassium are found in world-class concentrations in the Great Salt Lake and are being extracted with important societal and economic benefits. Sulfate of potash, or SOP, is the key product from Compass Minerals operations and the solar evaporation facility in west of Ogden, and it provides a low chloride potassium, and that goes to high value but essential vegetable, fruit, and tree nut crops. It's important because those crops are very sensitive. They're long living and very sensitive root systems, and the root systems cannot take chlorides, but they require potassium. So this method of potassium delivery to those crops is essential. Everything needs NPK. If you've seen on a fertilizer bag, nitrogen, phosphorus, K is potassium. So this is the way to deliver that. We're the largest producer of SOP in the Western Hemisphere, and really the only producer in North America. So our products go to the Central Valley in California, Florida, those areas where there's orchard crops. And it can be used for vegetables and whatnot, but there's the commodity form of potash that isn't produced from the lake, that's more abundant elsewhere in Saskatchewan and other places. But this is the niche but essential potassium product. We're also pursuing a sustainable lithium operation at our operation. The brines that flow in through our system have significant concentrations of lithium. So the lithium is available in the brines, and it's actually kind of going out in our products right now. But there's new technology that's come online in the past 5 to 7 years, and it's flowing out the door in our magnesium chloride. So we're looking at ways to extract that from that stream without any incremental consumption of brine from the lake, and that feels like a very good use of the resource. This would be the fourth mineral coming off of our stream, and that's very exciting to me. I did some of the initial work towards developing this, and that was the most compelling thing about this to me, and that we really could do this in a sustainable way. If I could just update, there's.
I think everyone finds this interesting because I think to a lot of us it's a big mystery. This is not a place that people go visit, right? And so,
it's remote. But on the economic study, BYU last year updated the economics of the lake, and the lake now generates from extraction industry $1.5 billion. With a labor income of an additional $425 million on the back of 5,400 jobs. It's 5,400 jobs. It's a significant employer. When you break that down,
that's of the lake broadly, is that right? Not just Compass Minerals, but
the extractive industry. When you break that down, that's $79,000 in salary for each of those jobs. So it's a significant producer of jobs as well.
Leave it to someone at the University of Utah to not know about a BYU study. Joe, just a follow-up question or observation. What about Compass Minerals? How many employees do you have in the state? What's the value of the exports that you share? What kind of royalties do you pay to the state of Utah? I'm just trying to give people a richer understanding of your Compass Minerals impact.
Sure. We have 375 direct employees. We have 3 businesses or production areas in our Ogden facility, from salt to the potash and the magnesium chloride. And then there's 3 to 4x indirect jobs, so vendors, truckers, safety, security, and those sorts of jobs.
Yeah, that's great. And the royalties you pay, is that a public information or not?
We generally pay between 8 to 10 million in royalties a year.
Yeah, big number.
But that can really fluctuate.
Sure. I hope that was interesting. I want to do the same thing with Thomas now about the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative. So Thomas, maybe you can just kind of set the groundwork for that.
Sure. At least I'll try and be brief. But so we are a cooperative. We operate as a cooperative, not unlike many of the cooperatives in the U.S. We are a vertically integrated cooperative. So that means that we do harvest, process, and sell on behalf of our member companies. The product that we're interested in is brine shrimp, and people that were here today, throughout the day, we've heard quite a bit about the brine shrimp. We actually do not harvest the live adult brine shrimp, but we harvest the encysted offspring of the brine shrimp. That encysted offspring, as I think Bonnie was showing us earlier today, is dormant, mostly dormant when we harvest it. We try and pull it out of that dormancy and then dry it, but maintain the viability of that embryo. And then we sell it, and our customers are marine fish hatcheries and shrimp hatcheries worldwide. They use these brine shrimp, they hatch these brine shrimp and use it as an essential live food source for their carnivorous marine fish and shrimp larvae. That's basically the product that we sell. In terms of our operations, I can say we're about 110 regular full-time employees, over 200 seasonal employees during our harvest season. What else can I say?
How many companies are in the cooperative?
There are 20.
Okay.
Yeah. And so most of the companies that harvest brine shrimp on the Great Salt Lake are in the cooperative, all but one, really. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know enough to ask this question, but what I understand you to be saying is that your product is an input to aquaculture and shrimp. Getting this right so far? Please
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong. So for all of us that have eaten shrimp, have we been eating your product?
Yeah, good question.
What's the chances of that?
Well,
how much of it leaves the state?
No, it's interesting, and maybe I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I mean, we definitely have an international, worldwide reach. So the product that we produce is used for the production of approximately 20% of the farm-raised shrimp and fish worldwide, and it is essential for that 20%. So that represents over 12 million metric tons of farmed fish and shrimp on an annual basis. And for the shrimp only, I think it represents about $63 billion of value, and add probably $20 to $30 billion of farmed fish to that. So that's the reach. Now, you were asking, have we eaten brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake? If we're eating shrimp, about 90% of the shrimp consumed in the U.S. is farm-raised. And the Great Salt Lake represents about between 40 and 50% of the worldwide brine shrimp production. And so, yeah, if you've eaten shrimp from a supermarket, then you have about close to a 50% chance that shrimp has eaten brine shrimp from the Great Salt Lake in its very early life cycle.
Okay. I find these economic flows super interesting, that something starts here and then goes to California or goes somewhere else and then it comes back. Yeah. Okay. Gabriel, you are an economist, studies the economic contribution of things, has an economic mindset as you look at things. You and I both know that there's more to understanding economic impact than just the things that are traded in the market. And I wonder if you could just opine for a minute about the types of things at Great Salt Lake that have economic value, but we don't trade them in the marketplace.
So economists have an idea called non-market value, which is the things that, especially the environment gives the economy and gives people that aren't traded in the marketplace. For example, the birds that visit the Great Salt Lake have a value to bird watchers, not just the bird watchers at the Great Salt Lake, but the people who watch these birds in all the other places where they live out their life cycle, because they migrate. There's also something called existence value. So even if you never see the birds, if you care about the birds, then that's an economic non-market value for the birds. In addition, we've heard a lot about the adverse health effects that could come about if the Great Salt Lake shrinks or disappears. So you can think of the Great Salt Lake as protecting human health. And if we didn't have the Great Salt Lake, we'd have these dust storms, arsenic-laden dust impinging on the Wasatch Front. That would have indirect economic effects. It also have direct economic effects. You'd probably have not only increased medical expenses, decreased length of human life, but you'd also have people leaving the Wasatch Front, not wanting to move to the Wasatch Front. Potentially, the Great Salt Lake is protecting, I think, a large part of Utah's GDP just by having water keeping the dust down. So there are lots of different aspects to the economic effects of the Great Salt Lake.
Gabriel, you and I can kind of go back and forth about this for a minute, but one way to help people understand this and think about it is the Exxon Valdez tragedy many, many years ago. But I think it's a really good way of understanding how economists sometimes put a value on things. So Exxon Valdez, has an oil leak in a pristine bay in Alaska. They've got to pay a penalty for that. What do they pay? What amount do they pay? And economists, a whole arm of economics, does this type of valuation where they ask people, what would you pay to have that clean? you can help me here a little bit. What would you pay to just know that this was bequeathed to future generations unimpaired? And through that, they create a value. I'll let you add some more to that. But I thought that would be a helpful way for you to think about this, because to many people, just the fact that those birds are there has value. Maybe you don't pay an entry fee to do something on the lake, but that has value. And then we could even say the snow effect has value to skiers that, that they're not paying directly for.
Absolutely. So there are two related concepts, willingness to pay and willingness to accept. If you want to ask what's the value of let's say a national park, you can ask citizens, what are you willing to pay to retain this national park in its pristine state? Or what would you be willing to accept in compensation if the government decided to remove its national park status and have it be developed? So those are two different notions of valuation. They're different. One of them is constrained by income, because the answer to the question, what are you willing to pay, is constrained by your income. You can't pay more than your income. Whereas willingness to accept is not constrained by income. So these numbers are different, and actually the economic theory of valuation is one that is rather complicated. It's actually something that I've been doing current research on. So economists don't have all the answers in terms of valuation. And of course, there are other kinds of problems. Not just what do we value a national park or the Great Salt Lake, but what will our descendants value a national park or the Great Salt Lake? And how do we trade off our valuations versus their valuations? So these are difficult issues.
I really thickened the plot there for sure. One last thing, and then we'll go to Charles on agriculture. At least I read in the study that bioeconomics did that there's also an economic to the public sewage treatment assimilation of Great Salt Lake. And what I understood to be the case is that there's avoided cost from more expensive wastewater treatment. The way I read it to be that you can put water into the lake that isn't at a standard that you do in other areas. And so there's an actually value to that. I've seen some people nod. Maybe there's some people in utilities that do it. The point being, though, that when you think about the economic value of the lake, think how complicated we've just made this, right? It's not just the lakeside industries. It's not just, tourism and recreation. It's not just, the fact that you value it for future generations, but it's this mix of things that we have to try and balance with all these trade-offs. So Charles, I'm going to go to you. I want you to bring agriculture into the conversation. And I didn't know exactly how to set this up, so maybe I'll just do it this way. I think of agriculture as a lifestyle issue for much of our state. I think of lifestyle as a major economic contributor in the rural parts of our state. I think of agriculture as a small contribution to our overall economy when you take the whole economy. And you have to mix all of that in when we talk about the connection between agriculture and Great Salt Lake. So tell us a little bit about your background and then help us make this connection between the lake and agriculture.
Okay, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. A few gross numbers are the state of Utah ag grosses over $2 billion a year. In the Bear River Basin, where I'm from, up in northern Utah, we have an acreage of, I believe it's 480,000 acres in the Bear River Basin in the three states, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that includes 9 counties, starting in Summit County, Utah. And within that basin, we're generating about $800 million. And, the economist here would, I'm sure, understand what I've read. USU and USU Extension's recently done a presentation or a compilation of data from 2022, and they indicate that those dollars will turn over almost seven times in the economy. That being said, I don't have the numbers of ag employees within the basin or the state, but incidental things that happen with agriculture, and I think it was fascinating earlier today with the information on the birds and things, how many thousands or tens of thousands of birds come up on my farm or my neighbor's farms. I'm approximately 4 miles north of the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, and we get a lot. Like yesterday, we probably had 10,000 snow geese in the area that were resting in old corn stubble fields, alfalfa fields, wheat fields. So we do have an awful lot of wildlife that benefits from agriculture in the area. I don't know if any of you saw an article by a gentleman named Adrian, or not an article by him, but an article about him in the Salt Lake Tribune back in December, a gentleman by the name of Adrian Hunolt, who is a rancher up above Evanston, Wyoming, and he coincidentally is a commissioner on the Bear River Commission, and I serve for Utah and he serves for Wyoming. But he was indicating how his flood irrigated pastures are such excellent habitat for sandhill cranes and geese and other wildlife, just as it is on my farm and my pastures. And in the summer, how many thousands upon thousands of white-faced ibis come into our wheat and alfalfa fields and graze every day on these fields that we flood irrigate. That being said, I think with regard to some of what Representative Briscoe just said, I think it's obvious to me the climate change, and it's made it a struggle for people in agriculture when you have a year like this past summer when you have 22 days of above 100-degree temperature and try to irrigate those crops and satisfy the demand. Our environment has changed. In the state of Utah, from 1987 to 2017, there have been 133,000 acres of ground go out of production in Utah. And that I don't have the comparison population in that period, but in my active work in agriculture, which has been the last 50 years, agriculture has lost probably 150 to 200,000 acres, and the population of Utah has tripled. And I think there's a connection there with the population growth and climate change and demand on water that can't be all assessed to agriculture. Mm-hmm. Another quick comment is in the press and in some academia, there have been comments made about agriculture and how it's subsidized by water conservancy districts. In the Bear River Basin, in the 9 counties that we irrigate from, we get absolutely no compensation or benefit from our conservancy districts up there. Box Elder County and Cache County are the only 2 that have conservancy districts, and they do not provide any services to us besides cloud seeding, which benefits all of us in our basins. And coincidentally, I've been employed by North American Weather as a contract employee for the last 34 years, and I'm trying to do my part to increase water to the Great Salt Lake through that method, as well as these other issues.
Charles, thanks for sharing the perspective. And just to kind of highlight a couple of these, because I think it's going to be, it'll help us juxtapose some of the trade-offs that we might want to consider. But so you've got the economic impact of agriculture, particularly off the Wasatch Front. You've got farms that provide habitat for birds. You've got, you didn't mention it, but the recharging of aquifers that comes through irrigation. Charles mentioned something quite interesting that you hear quite a bit, right? That there's a lot of thinking that we need to get more water to the lake and less to farms. And Charles is making the point that we've lost hundreds of thousands of acres, 150,000 acres of farmland, and it's still not, helped, at least to the degree that we see a lake that's stable.
Sure, and that's a statewide number. That's not Great Salt Lake Basin number specifically.
But it just something to think about, right? Because we know there's a lot of urbanization or a lot of population growth and densifying of our population. Okay, where should we take this? I want to just go. The way I think of this is there's a lot of trade-offs here. There's the economic impact of the lake, and then there's the health impacts, and then there's the ecological impacts. And a lot of times, the way this gets centered in policy discussions is what is the lake level that is optimal? And I wondered, maybe starting with Compass and with Joe. Give us your take on this whole idea of what's a healthy lake level that gives us the magic mix of, healthy ecology, manages the health impacts, and keeps the economic impact what we'd like it to be.
Thank you.
I didn't tell him this question was coming, and I don't know if that meant that he liked it or he didn't.
No, I don't look at it an ideal elevation. I look at it as an ideal range of elevations.
Okay. So there's a principle there that not a single elevation but a range.
And I think that's your intent, but it's not to be particular about it. But I don't look at it as 4198 has been socialized recently in the press as the ideal elevation. I look at it as a range, and the users of the lake have their sort of own sort of ideal ranges, and there's a matrix that's been publicized, through the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, that illustrates all the uses and their ideal ranges in color-coded green, yellow, orange. Mm-hmm. So that's how I look at it, and the way mineral extraction and Compass look at that is, in an annual cycle, there's a 2 to 2.5 foot swing in lake elevations. So that's quite significant if you think about it. Think about a lake and having that sort of elevation swing. And then, a period of years, a handful of years, there's broader swings, up or down, and we're in a downswing. So we've grown accustomed to managing those regimes, those elevation regimes. We've certainly navigated the floods in the 80s at extremely high levels. We don't seem to hang around.
Were you with Compass then?
Sorry?
Were you with Compass during the high levels?
No.
That must have been crazy, but anyway, okay.
Yeah, that was Great Salt Lake Minerals, our predecessor.
Okay.
So we've grown accustomed to operating in those lake level regimes, high, middle, and low, and we can adjust our operations, and the operations were designed, with that kind of flexibility and agility.
I take that as really good news, though, because if you can adjust, that is saying to me that you can continue doing what you do that serves the public good and creates an economic impact, but there are ranges that are better for the ecology and for health. So I think that's good. Let's go to the brine shrimp. And how do you feel about the target ranges as a way to help manage the complexity of these issues and the trade-offs?
Similar to Joe, we're not so much fixated on one elevation. We'd love it to be 4198. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. We could probably live with a 4190. What is much more important to us is actually the salinity range. And so we have the ability to manage the salinity somewhat in the South Arm to support the ecosystem of the South Arm. So at a 4190, as long as we can maintain that salinity range somewhere between 9% and 16%, that still is, that can still function for us. Mm-hmm. That works. Once you go below that range, it becomes, quite expensive just to access the lake, and it becomes much more difficult.
And Thomas, I just want to clarify something. so if salinity is what you really are concerned about, is the lake level a good proxy for a healthy salinity? And the reason I ask that is that I think it's very wise public policy to set a measure goal to work towards. Yeah. And I can live with a range, because of the variability and the complexity. But what's hard is when everyone says it's not about the level, it's about the salinity or about something else. And sometimes it feels like it's just a red herring to not have a level. And I wanted to just, and everything I've seen tells me that the lake level is a good proxy for health of the lake.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I talk about the brine shrimp population per se, so I'm not an expert in microbialites, I'm not an expert in brine flies, where I think the lake level is actually more important because the microbialites do need to be covered with water to function. But we do have a bidirectional flow between the north and the south arm, and we can adjust that flow because of the adaptive management berm. And so at a certain elevation, we can have a range of salinities by adapting that bidirectional flow. And so it's really difficult for me to say, okay, there's really an absolute target range. It's really about a target salinity. Now, there are other factors that play a role. Nutrients are important to the ecosystem. The lake is nutrient limited, primarily nitrogen limited. So you can decrease the volume of the lake and still have the necessary nutrients there to support, a healthy ecosystem. But then again, the ecosystems are linked. Microbialites are linked to brine shrimp, and they are linked to the avian population. And so, yes, there probably is an ideal range, or maybe not an ideal range, but a target range that you could come up with to protect the entire ecosystem.
Okay, very good. Just to level set for just a minute, boy, I've got maybe 10 questions that have come in. Cynthia's got a mic, and she's going to also allow everyone else to answer questions. We're going to have questions for like the last half hour of this, so that's 4 or 5 minutes away. Joe, you gave me a little blink that you wanted to say something, and then I want to go to you, Gabriel, to just add in whatever you'd like before we go to questions. So, Joe?
So we're living through a very low regime, a record low regime, and we're working as stakeholders through this and sort of trudging through it as a salinity advisory committee. Both Thomas and I sit on that committee and other councils and committees. But the way I look at it is we're focused on the ideal, but we're not in an ideal elevation profile right now, and that's obvious. So, the question, or the way I look at things and other sort of challenges is, what's the ideal, but also what is the functional and what is the critical? What is the green light, the yellow light, the red light? And, there's been a lot of focus on the ideal, but we're at a place now where, some of the stakeholder interest are, sort of in the functional range at this point. And I would just throw that in.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Gabriel, I want you to go ahead and just add some more color commentary and perspective, and then we'll go to a couple of questions here, and then we'll go to the audience. So, Gabriel.
So I wanted to mention something about agriculture because that's a field that I've done some research on for the last few years. And also there's a lot of misunderstanding there. Senator Stuart Adams, who's the president of the Utah State Senate, was quoted in December of 2021 as saying that 22% of Utah's GDP comes from farming, comes from agriculture. The actual number is much less, as Natalie, you, I think, alluded to. And in particular, I'd like to talk about hay. There's alfalfa and there's also grass hay. Hay generates approximately 0.2% of Utah's GDP. So not 1%, but a lot less than 1% of Utah's GDP. About 2/3 of the water that is used in Utah is used to grow hay. So the elevation of the Great Salt Lake and the Colorado River is primarily a question of water use in agriculture and overwhelmingly of water use for alfalfa. And Jared Manning he's deputy state engineer from the Division of Water Rights, was quoted in the Salt Lake Tribune a couple of days ago by saying that if we instituted a system of water leasing where the state would buy water from farmers to give to the Great Salt Lake, that you're talking billions of dollars to help the Great Salt Lake. Well, the profits are not the gross revenue, but the net revenue. This is a statewide figure for alfalfa. In 2020 was about 242 million. If you were to spend 242 million to buy up all the water that's used to basically dry up all the alfalfa farms in Utah, and fully compensate the farmers for that, so that the farmers didn't suffer. Now there are non-farmers who might suffer, and we shouldn't forget those. But if you did that, then you could divert to nature 3 times the amount of water that's used in all of Utah's cities and towns. So this gives you some idea of the difference between the water use in agriculture and the water use in urban areas.
Okay, Gabriel, good. I mean, just good perspective. Charles, I want to come to you. I've got an iPad in front of me with questions coming in from the online audience. And we've kind of set the stage of like understanding some of the issues here. What I think we should really be interested in is where there's common ground, right? Because reasonable people can disagree and have different perspectives. One of the places of common ground is ag water optimization. And to Gabriel's point about that, lining of canals, leveling of fields, investing in pressurized systems. Someone wrote in here, is it more efficient to flood irrigate versus a sprinkling system? Why do you flood irrigate? And so I want to ask you that, and also just let the listening audience know that I believe it was $200 million, Representative Briscoe can help me here, of money was allocated this year for ag water optimization. So there's something here.
Sure. And in our area under Bear River Canal Company, we're primarily flood irrigators, similar to what goes on in Millard County. And part of the reason we do that is the energy costs that it would take to pressurize the system. So we're saving on energy. The net depletion is not that much greater than it would be under pivot irrigation. We don't have the evaporation losses that sprinkler irrigation does. And our soil structure has enough salt in it. If we don't do some periodic deep irrigation, then the soil structure starts to deteriorate. There are a number of farmers in my area who are using drip irrigation, but specifically on an onion crop, which is a very shallow-rooted crop, and it can tolerate that for 1 year. Onions have to be can't be planted year after year in the same field. They have to be rotated out 4 to 5 years, and your soil structure will recover when you plant wheat or corn or alfalfa and go back to flood irrigation. And but the water optimization program that has been offered by the state helps us to become more efficient with flood irrigation. Virtually our whole valley and most of the flood irrigated areas in the state have been laser leveled, and we're very much more efficient than we were
already done that
20 or 30 years ago.
Thomas, you've got to add something.
Yeah, I would just like to comment on this, because I think you're right that with regard to ag optimization, we're all in favor of that. But I think what's also important is that we connect the savings in water that we actually are able to, the water that we conserve, that we're actually able to bring that water to the Great Salt Lake. And I think that's where there's still a really strong disconnect And it's going to take some time for all of us to figure that out, but it's an important aspect that we're not able to figure out right yet.
Okay, very good. All right, we're going to do kind of lightning round because some of these questions can be answered very quickly, but I want to be responsive to them. And this is kind of hard because some of them are really detailed, and I'm trying to go to some of the easy ones. This one, I guess, is for Compass Minerals. Does bifurcating the lake by raising the berm threaten your operations?
Well, it's definitely a change, a profound change, and an unprecedented.
And the governor did this by stroke of a pen during the last session. Fair? I mean, is that how I understood it? Was an executive order?
That's correct, and I understand. I understand that was an action to arrest the rise of salinity in the South Arm, but it shouldn't be forgotten that it's an unprecedented action. And it's being executed in a federal jurisdictional water body. And it can be done on a temporary basis, but we need to watch it that it doesn't morph into a permanent action, which would undergo a much different process, which would be a Clean Water Act, NEPA sort of level analysis.
I am so grateful that you're here today to just explain some of this to us, right? Because a lot of times you just hear things or you read something, and we've got Compass Minerals here in the room with us. Yeah, go ahead. Maybe the brine shrimp industry has something here as well.
Yeah, I think it's important also.
Is it right that you're in the north end and you're in the south end?
Yeah,
I've got this right. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important to note that it was an emergency measure. And it was definitely intended as a temporary measure.
Okay.
And as a salinity advisory committee, we're trying to see how we can, in the future, work that adaptive management berm to where it maintains functionality for all the users.
Okay. I've got another question here that's asking, where does the hay that's grown in the Great Salt Lake water basin go?
It goes worldwide, just like our wheat and our corn and our beef and our dairy products. It's interesting to me that if you buy cottage cheese from Walmart, it's produced in California. So we send hay to California and they send cottage cheese back to us. That's, we're in a worldwide market. And, when Vladimir Putin starts bombing the living daylights out of Ukraine, all of a sudden the wheat market jumps up and my wheat crop is much more valuable than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
So we are affected by everything on the planet, just as the brine shrimpers provide product worldwide as well.
Natalie, I can add just some statistics. The percentage by value, so not by weight, of Utah's hay that was sold to foreign countries in the year 2020 was about 29%. And about 2/3 of that 29% was sent to China.
Okay, this one I think there's an easy answer to. It will be mostly to Thomas and Joe, but the question is, should industries that make money off the lake pay the public for consuming the water? I'll let you two respond to that.
Well, we do pay royalties for all of our products, salt, magnesium chloride, and potash, in significant royalty streams that benefit the lake, and some recent legislation last year ensure that those monies go back to the lake.
Yeah.
And that's a positive thing.
Same answer for you.
Yeah, similar answer. We pay royalties as well. We also pay permit fees, and those permit fees have gone over the last 25 years or so towards studying the ecosystem in order to try and protect the ecosystem. Yeah.
Okay. There's been...
I will note that the one sector that doesn't pay for using water, it pays for transporting water, but not for using water, is agriculture.
I don't know, Charles, if you want to respond to that or...
Well, cities aren't paying for water either, except for their pumping costs. They have water rights that they're not paying for. In my water conservancy district, we're dealing with a situation where we pay property taxes to them, but we do not receive direct benefit as maybe some places in the state do. But we are, it's just interesting. Recently, we went through truth and taxation in our district, which was quite painful. And then almost immediately, a multinational corporation comes in and declares a economic development area, and they want us to help subsidize the development of a multinational corporation that's far more wealthy than the farmers in Box Elder County.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to questions, and Cynthia has the mic. But just as she's taking it to the first person there, Charles, can you just hit one more quick question here? I think this is an easy one. There's been some discussion about fallowing land to get additional water to the Great Salt Lake. Give us some context for that.
Sure. We were looking at the possibility of participating in some of these programs, and as good as the snowpack was, we were short on time to get the discussion out to the shareholders. The individual farmers own the company. We don't dictate as a board of directors what the shareholders are going to do. And so we looked at that. The hazards with that can be, and they not necessarily, but some of the things we worry about is that those things will never come back to agriculture. And we are a group that relies on a massive amount of economy to sustain our fertilizer dealers and
you need that critical
dealers.
Mass.
Yeah. If we start cutting back, it's like in Ogden, the largest grain elevator in Ogden is you're going up I-15, you'll pass it. It's on the west side of the freeway. It shut down a year ago because the acreage of wheat had dropped to a level, and I could see it as I delivered my wheat at harvest. 5 years ago, I'd have to wait in line to dump my truck. 3 years ago, I could just go in and dump, and they lost so much acreage in northern Utah that they could no longer sustain it themselves, and consequently, the farmers in my area had to scramble and go out and build brand new grain bins at a considerable cost. With the price of steel what it is, it was very expensive. And that was the resolution to a grain elevator of that size closing down.
Okay. Please, your question.
Okay, I'm Chris Klein. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The question I've got is an economic question about natural resource services and natural resource service value. And it's also called ecological services. It's kind of a two-part question. One, I'm wondering if there's been a calculation of the natural resource service value that's provided by the Great Salt Lake, and there's been some references to, snowpack and, treating wastewater, things like that. So I'm wondering if that's been done. But then the other question I'm wondering about is with respect to agriculture, if you look at those natural resource service values and look at the values to ecosystem, keeping ecosystems together, if there's been a calculation of what the cost would be to, and I guess this is more difficult from an economic standpoint, but what would be the cost to the environment of losing, farmed agriculture and irrigated agriculture, and the ways that water is, used by agriculture. For example, flood irrigation provides habitat, it supports groundwater. And, when you look at, ag has a relatively small dollar footprint, I think that that's not considering the whole picture of what agriculture is actually supporting. And I'm wondering if there's been any work to try to come up with any kind of valuation on that helps, even that consideration and even out the just the evaluation of these different uses. So thanks.
So I don't think there has been any work done on that, and an applied environmental economist, and there are some at Utah State University, for example, would be well positioned to undertake a study like that. About agriculture, I guess what I would say is, if we were to transition to smaller number of acreage used in agriculture, then the question is, how do you manage that transition? So permanently fallowing land, yes, it's not going to be flood irrigated anymore. There's going to be less groundwater recharge. So basically what you're doing then is you're reverting the ecosystem back to the way it was before agriculture got started. And I suppose a broader question is that bad or good? There are bad and good aspects to it. I suppose my hunch would be that in the long run, reverting to a more natural ecosystem isn't going to hurt the Great Salt Lake, but you would have local effects.
Okay. We'll go to another question, but as we're walking there, Charles, a quick question for you. Are there options for crops in Utah that can produce comparable revenue to alfalfa and hay that use less water?
To my knowledge, my most profitable crop is going to be alfalfa or corn, and they use comparable amounts of water. Years ago, when we had sugar beets, they were a higher value crop, and they took, I believe, more water than alfalfa actually did.
Okay. That helps. I didn't see where the mic went. Okay, there you go.
Thank
you. Good enough.
The Artemia industry operates using a sustainable model based on a population count of cysts during the harvest. And I was wondering if mineral extractors is there some way that a sustainable model for mineral extraction on the lake, both in the North and South Arm, with water as the key operative, could be considered?
Go ahead, yeah.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, there's sort of a natural kind of response to the low lake levels. Compass has invested significantly in our ponds to make them more efficient. While there's certainly business benefit to that, what that's done is actually enabled us to reduce our consumption year over year, and on average by about 20%. We've also discovered, with over 50 years of operating on the lake, that we have salt accumulation in our ponds, and there's good brine in that. And that's been a bridge resource that we've been harvesting as opposed to taking from the lake, because as a lake falls, your ability to get the brine, your hydraulics change in your pumping system. So our consumption naturally goes down as a natural response to the lake conditions. So we've realized a significant drop in our consumption as a response to the brine, or the low lake levels. So it's kind of a natural effect of that. There's other things that we're doing to, again, bridge the gap. We're the only provider of SOP in the country to keep our customers demand satisfied, because it is an essential mineral. We have to have it for fruit, nut, and tree nut crops.
Very good. Okay, another question from the audience. Okay, up here.
Considering that the lake has such a profound effect on these industries, and its shrinking could prove a threat to its continued existence, what would be the empirical effect on the quality of life of everyday Utahns should these industries be disrupted?
Well, I reviewed the economic, what's generated from an economy standpoint, but from stepping back, the folks who work in these jobs, they're local, and we have so many sort of multi-generational people legacies who work in our companies, and enables them to stay local, close to the families in a rural part of northern Utah. And because we produce essential minerals that really can't be produced elsewhere in the States because it's not found in economic quantity, these are stable jobs. So you don't have the ebb and flow that that you see in other sectors of the economy. These are stable jobs, and that enable kind of these multi-generation legacy.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, I believe it was 375 direct employees, so that's 375 families.
Correct.
Depending, just one way to think of it. Okay, we've got another question in the middle here. Just right before you ask your question, I want to just cue up to the panel that someone has written in, re-asked the question that Representative Briscoe asked the first panel from this perspective. What convince all of you to relook at some of the damage that's been done and help us collaborate? So we'll come back to that. Let's ask the question, but I want you to just think about, you could say that we all care about the economy, health, and ecology, but there's different ways of doing that, and there's different benefits and costs, and the question is, where do we find common ground? But let's go to your question, and then I'm going to hit them up with that one.
Thanks for this opportunity. I'm Willie Lanier with the Utah Department of Health and Human Services. How do we address the concerns voiced by the farming community and farmers that the water that they might choose to not use and let flow past their farm actually may not make it to the Salt Lake? Is that a real concern? Is that just something that is not actually a concern? Is there some downstream user that might actually increase their use as a result of more water being flowing past those farms toward the Salt Lake?
I can take a stab at that.
Okay, that's great. And I wanted to just mention that the Great Salt Lake Strike Team had this as one of their 6 recommendations to make sure that the conserved water is committed to the lake and that it gets there.
Yeah, it's got to be committed for sure. In order to get it there, I think the mechanisms are in place. I believe state engineers can shepherd that water, starting from the Great Salt Lake and the users that are at the bottom of that flow and then going up. So I think the mechanisms are there. They just have to be used.
Okay. So he's saying that we can shepherd the water to the lake, but you have to do it proactively, and that there's tools to do it.
Natalie,
yes, please tell us.
I think and we've recently within our canal company had some discussions about this, and there needs to be considerable investment in measuring devices throughout the entire Great Salt Lake Basin so that there's an accurate accounting of these things.
I think I can predict that developing the data resources, the modeling resources, the technical resources, the policy innovations to solve this problem, that is where this state is headed. Okay, let's do one more question from the audience, and I'll let Cynthia pick where she wants to go, who raises their hand the highest. And we got to wrap up by 5. We've got about 8 minutes here, and we have a last set of questions for you.
I just wanted to ask for clarification. When you asked, is there a desirable lake level? There was a clear answer that there's a minimum acceptable level for brine shrimp, below which it's just too saline. I was unclear when it comes to minerals. Are you saying you'll take it at any level, or is there a minimum level below which your enterprise is just not economic?
Well, what I'd say is, as Thomas mentioned before, that there's a correlation between lake level and salinity. So there's a kind of an assumption, in many of the councils and committees and meetings that I attend, that it's beneficial to mineral extraction to have higher salinity because it's easier to concentrate and it's already concentrated. What I can say is, on a low lake level regime, you can get out of range for how the system is designed. So different salts will fall out at different concentrations in the process. So it can happen that if they fall out too early and you don't have the infrastructure in your ponds in order to harvest that and that's unfortunate. That's a loss. It's a loss for everybody.
Okay. Oh, I heard a.
So is there a acceptable lower level? There's nothing that's cut and dried as for the brine shrimp.
Our online listeners can't hear that, but the gentleman is pressing on the point. Is there a level where brine shrimp and mineral production aren't feasible? And where I see that on my chart here having serious adverse effects is below 4192. But maybe it's more of a range. Okay, let's do this. We just got a couple more minutes. I wanted each of you to answer 2 questions, and we'll do them really, really briefly. And Joe, we'll start with you and work this way. Go back to the question that was asked about what do we have to do to get all of these interests together to figure this out as a state?
Well, actually, in October and November last year, as a stakeholder community, different interest, we were in an emergency sort of all hands on deck status. The salinity spiked really unexpectedly in the South Arm, and there was real concern and palpable concern. Mm-hmm. I'm not a brine shrimp expert, but I definitely respect Bonnie Baxter and John Luft and those who are expert in it. So, from our point on the lake, we're impacted by the presence of a temporary but completely severing berm. We're impacted, but we understand, and for the betterment of the lake on a temporary basis, we have the flexibility, as I described earlier, to draw on other internal resources temporarily. So I think that's an example of kind of pulling together.
Give and take, yeah. Gabriel?
I think in the long run, the agricultural sector in Utah is going to shrink. And while it's rather easy for the state to engage in water leasing or on a more permanent basis, water sales that is permanently fallowing land, you're going to, and these would be willing transactions, so between willing buyer and willing seller. There are secondary effects. You mentioned the fertilizer salesman. So there are other people who live in rural areas, even some who live in urban areas, who depend on the agricultural economy. And if the society decides that that we're going to preserve the Great Salt Lake, and therefore we're going to shrink the agricultural sector, I would hope that we'd also decide to supplement the incomes of the people who depend on the agricultural sector and are going to get hurt, but they don't have any water rights to sell to the state.
Okay. Charles, what do we have to do to get at the table and work out solutions to these complex problems?
Well, we've been in discussions with the Department of Natural Resources trying to feel our way around this. Our canal company isn't a political entity, but we represent people and they come to the table, and there are a myriad of different opinions about how we should do things or not do things. And so, it gets extremely difficult for us how to parse this out, whether we get the entire canal company to be benefited from a group contribution, or if we single out individual shareholders and we start picking at each other that way. One thing I'd like to say is I'm kind of a NPR listener, which is very unusual for a farmer, I guess. But anyway, I try listening to the other radio, and
you're on a panel
nuts.
on the Great Salt Lake at the University of Utah. Like you're really there.
Yeah. Anyway, but I did hear just recently on NPR that in the next 25 years, this planet has to produce as much food as it has in the last 5,000 years. So that's where we are with the population growth and the diminishing of agriculture on the planet.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Thomas, you get the last word. We're going to give the brine shrimp the last word.
Oh, thank you. I think the state of Utah and the state agencies have a history of bringing the different stakeholders together. And we've experienced that. We've experienced that with Division of Water Quality, Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, Division of Wildlife Resources. And I think it's not always easy. It's sometimes a little, it can be a little harsh at times. But over the years, we've come up with the solutions to most of these problems. And I think we can do it again. I think compromises are possible. Ag optimization is possible. It is possible to get that water to the lake. I think we can figure out a way to keep the salinity within the range that it needs to be, while still supporting the mineral companies. The possibilities are there. We're a lot of smart people in this room that can come up with these solutions, and it's just a question of talking it out and coming to the compromise. And we have a good history of doing that in our state.
Yeah. So what a hopeful way to end the discussion. Let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you for a dignified and instructive conversation.
Let me thank Natalie for moderating this very interesting panel. Thomas, Joe, Charles, Gabriel, thank you for joining us, and thank you for contributing to our understanding of the Great Salt Lake. Let me thank once again our principal funders for the 28th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, our founding donor since 1996. The Cultural Vision Fund, and our sponsoring donors, the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, and Nature Conservancy in Utah. We wouldn't be here without their support, and we wouldn't be here without your support. And so let me extend thanks to all of you for your interest in this very important public issue that we're dealing with. And let me say that we've tried to set the stage today by highlighting exactly what the problem is. And tomorrow we intend to get into the solutions. And we will have with us a number of people that are right on the front lines, as these folks are. And please join us tomorrow morning. We'll have the governor here, the Speaker of the House, Bishop Waddle from the LDS Church, and a number of people involved with the various task forces, trusts, strike teams, etc., who will hopefully enlighten us on how we might move toward those compromise positions. With that, thank you again for joining us today, both everyone here, but also those of you online. We'll get started at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. There'll be food here at 7:15. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thanks again. Hey, thanks.